Okay, so you saw the title of the video and the thumbnail and you're thinking to yourself, this guy's an idiot because female Summer Shez has Swift Slice and Swift Slice good because effective damage and yada 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 yada. And to be fair, Swift Slice is good. It does have effective damage, but there is one key difference between Summer Male Shez and Summer Female Shez that, in my opinion, makes male significantly better than female, and that is their archetype. You have a melee flyer versus a melee cav. And while that may not seem significant on the surface, I will die on this hill saying that Summer Male Shez is significantly stronger and much better than female Shez just because he's a melee flyer. You know, at least until they introduce more stuff into the game and yada yada yada, but neither here nor there. Currently, this is what we're dealing with currently. Summer Male Shez, in my opinion, is much better than Summer Female Shez. And I have several points as to why, or maybe not several. Just, I have points. I have points. Point number one, the role. You have a Summer Female Shez who has a dual-phase brave weapon. You know, well, actually, they both have the same weapon. They both have a Canto remaining +1 dual-phase brave speedy weapon that does true damage based on their speed. It's a very, very good weapon to have. The only differentiator between the male and female is that female has her legendary PRF skill, Swift Slice, which on the player phase, if she meets a certain speed check, depending on the foe she goes up against, she gets effective damage against them, which will allow her to output a significant amount of damage. Now, when trying to compare the two in terms of roles, it's kind of difficult on that front, mainly because, well, you can't really compare a player phase cav to a enemy phase or like mixed phase melee flyer, because they don't really mesh in that category. So rather than trying to compare the two in that front, I would much rather discuss what they individually bring to the table. Summer Female Shez is a hard-hitting player-phase cavalry sword with dual-phase brave, so no matter what, she's always getting 2 attacks out, and if she's able to meet her speed check, which, depending on the foe she goes up against, it'll be relatively easy or it'll be relatively difficult, she's going to end up doing a lot of damage. Generally, the slower ones that have a lot more mixed bulk are going to be easier to take down because of the effective damage that she gets from her A slot, but at the same time, the ones that are a bit faster means that they could potentially also shrug off a lot of the effective damage that could have otherwise been prevalent, and maybe depending on their mixed bulk and whether or not she ends up having maybe a bit less speed or they end up speed tying, she's still getting 2 attacks out, meaning that her damage output's still going to be relatively consistent. But at the same time, we were never really lacking in very hard-hitting cavalry units. We've had plenty of them in the past, and we still have plenty of them now. And while I do think Summer Female Shez is an incredible cavalry nuke because Swift Slice is very good on top of dual phase brave and true damage from the weapon, I don't think she necessarily brings anything new. For me, the equivalent would be you get a new God Sword who has good speed, but then you get a newer God Sword a few months later that has even more speed. They both do the same thing for the most part, but one is just slightly better. I don't want to diminish her damage output whatsoever, but when we also have skills such as Close Call 4, which just grants 11 speed for the sake of it, and Guard Bearing 4 just having flat damage reduction with no check whatsoever, on top of being in an archetype that doesn't have any sort of damage reduction piercing abilities, her damage output and her general speed checks are going to be a lot harder comparatively. The Brave will still help in terms of damage output, but otherwise it's really just a toss-up, especially against a lot of modern sword infantry tanks or just infantry speed tanks that have the speed to combat it, because yeah, Close Call 4 and all those Dodge 4 skills are pretty cheap. Meanwhile, with Summer Male Shez, while he isn't entirely new conceptually, you know, Lance Flyer with all sorts of whatever, he is a lot more unique in terms of what he brings to the table. Obviously, a lot of the sets are going to be relatively the same across all sorts of archetypes. He has a lot more flexibility comparatively to a lot of other flyers in that archetype. For example, if you're running somebody like Har or Cormag and you want them to run like Guard Bearing and all that stuff, where their B slots are taken up and they're really just going to be there to act like a really fat wall so that your units can then teleport in and do whatever, Shez can go in, attack with 2 attacks because he has Brave, hit really, really hard, and because of the Canto remaining in his weapon, he can then backpedal and still perform his role as if he were acting as a melee specialist with Guard Bearing and all that stuff, which in my opinion makes him a lot more threatening as a melee flyer comparatively to almost any other unit of his kind. Obviously, there are other units that you could compare him to, like Rearmed Ingrid, although they don't necessarily do the same thing. She does have Canto in her A, so she can still mimic a fair amount of stuff, but with his Brave effect in his weapon, I find that he's just going to be doing a lot more than a lot of other units in his archetype. And something I already briefly touched upon while talking about just this whole male Shez thing was guard bearing and all these skills, because something that he has a lot more of comparatively to summer female Shez is access to good skills. In the grand scheme of it all, summer female Shez doesn't really need anything else in her kit. Granted, she can't really use much else. She has Kanto in her weapon, so she can't really use Alarm unless you just want the extra stats. And she has low speed defense 4, which is already good for speed checks and damage output. But outside of maybe some other niche cases, if you could set it up like Vantage, there really isn't much else you can do with her, especially since her A slot is being taken up by Swift Slice. There really isn't an easy way of setting up Vantage unless you were to ditch it, but at that point you're just giving up way too much damage output for what it's really worth. Because of the effects in her weapon on top of her A slot being occupied, she's really locked into a player phase role, which isn't bad by any means, but it just means she could do the one thing and one thing really well. Whereas male Shez having access to guard bearing, guidance 4, rain snap, and so much more allows him to perform a significant amount of roles that female Shez just can't. Which, again, it's really hard to just compare melee cav to melee flyer, but in my opinion, melee flyers are just significantly stronger right now. Granted, he does need a good amount of inheritance because guard bearing and guidance 4 are extremely expensive, whereas summer female Shez, you could just summon one and she's ready to use right out of the gate, which is really convenient. That's really the only thing stopping him. It's the barrier of entry. And this final point really isn't as consequential because, to be fair, she has that one niche. That's just kind of how it goes, and a lot of units kind of fall into one similar niche, and that's what they do. I find that male Shez having access to all sorts of stuff allows him to be more ubiquitous in his builds, again due to skill accessibility and just being a speedy dual phase brave unit. Granted, a fair amount of these builds can be mimicked by female Shez if you really want to give up Swift Slice. That's why I don't think it's as consequential, but really at the end of it, male Shez just has access to a lot more skills that allows him to stand out a lot more. And again, I think part of that also has to do with the fact that melee flyers right now are probably some of the better meta units that you could run right now. Obviously, it will depend on which one you run, because if you run some generic, well, I guess it depends on their stats too. Really, the main attraction is going to be guard bearing 4 with guidance 4, because it allows you to not only act as a really suitable frontliner that you can't really initiate on as safely as a lot of other units that would otherwise be frontlining, but you can also provide backline support for units to then teleport in, including far save since it also works with guidance, and you can continue to pile on a really high offensive presence while still maintaining your ability to not only act in combat but also act as a really good wall, which in my opinion is a lot more valuable currently than just running any sort of player phase cavalry nuke, which again, to be fair, isn't the only thing she can do, but really at the end of the day, he just has a lot more flexibility. And really, with all that being said, you're comparing one really good unit that does a really good thing to another good unit that does a lot of good things, and it's whatever. If you like Shez, use Shez. Shez Nation, Shez Sweep, both of them are pretty good at the end of the day. But I think male is currently better.